welcome to our Science of Reading series. Let's talk about orthographic mapping. And today we will be talking all about how to use magnetic letters for encoding and decoding. And you will walk away from this session with some really practical strategies and ways to implement orthographic mapping processing in your classroom. And I'm really excited that you're here with us today, and I can't wait for you to learn everything about orthographic mapping. So just to get started, I am Jen Doyle. I am the Director of Education Innovation at PDX Reading, and I have with me Haley and Michelle, my colleagues. Haley will be here monitoring the chat. So if you need anything, feel free to put it in the chat, and Michelle will be here to help with anything Zoom related. So just reach out if you're having any difficulties there. But I'm really excited to get started. So here is our agenda for today. We will be talking all about how the brain learns words. And this is really important to understand because we want to understand the science behind the brain, and that way we can implement best practice in the classroom. Then we'll talk all about what is orthographic mapping? What is this process? And then we'll look at why we use magnetic letters and then how we use magnetic letters. And I'll walk you through a lesson so you'll see step by step how to use the magnetic letters in your classroom. And then we'll talk all about how to organize these materials, because that can be a big challenge. If you're not organized with the magnetic letters, it can make it that much harder to teach and for students to learn with them. And then we'll close with a Q&A. And so that's our agenda for today. And then if you've come to this session with questions about orthographic mapping, go ahead and put them in the chat, or as I'm speaking, feel free to put questions in the chat and I'll answer all of them at the end. So that way, if something comes up at any point, just put it in the chat and Haley will be keeping track of all of those questions. So to just get started, I also want to let you know that we'll be doing a giveaway at the end. You will have a chance to win a magnet board that looks like this. And this word work board comes with all of the letter sound magnets that you see here. And then the back of it looks like this. And you can use the prefix suffix root magnets on this side to build words. And then all the letter sound magnets go on the inside. And this is dry erase. And so students can use the bottom part of the board for writing. And as well as the back right here is an area for writing. And so if you stay till the end, you'll be able to enter to win our giveaway. So pay attention during the session and you'll be able to answer a question at the end to win. So before we get started into orthographic mapping, I want to go over some key terms that are really important to understand. And this is kind of like the foundation for understanding orthographic mapping. So I'm going to start off with phonemes, and phonemes can be a little bit confusing, but the best way to think about it is that it is the smallest unit of sound that changes a meaning in the word. And so if we look at our example down here of an acorn, so we've got that long A sound. That A is a phoneme, and the first phoneme in the word acorn. And so if we take away that long A sound in acorn, we're left with the word corn. And so that is a completely different meaning than the word acorn. So that long A changes the meaning of the word. Now there are 44 phonemes in the English language, which there are 26 letters and 44 phonemes. So that can be a really tricky thing for students to learn. Next, we have graphemes. And graphemes are the smallest unit of written sound. And so if we take again the example of the acorn, I'm showing here 4 different graphemes that represent that long A sound. And so the AY is the long A spelling in the word play, and the A consonant E spelling is the long A spelling in the word cake. And then we have the AI spelling, which is the long A grapheme in the word rain. And then AIGH, that grapheme, is used in the word straight. And so you can see these are just 4 different ways to spell that long A sound. And what's so complicated and confusing about English is that we've got these 44 phonemes, and there's so many different ways to spell those phonemes. And so it also depends on the type of English that you're learning. So if you're learning American English versus Canadian or British, there are different graphemes. So there are actually over 250 graphemes in English. So that can be a really complicated thing for students to learn, which is why tools like magnetic letters are really helpful. And I'll explain more about this as we go through, but it helps students to not have to recall all of those graphemes by seeing them on the board, by seeing all those graphemes and not having to think about all the different ways to spell. And then you can see behind me here, I've got my vowel graphemes here that are used. These are foam magnets that teachers can use to model and demonstrate, and students can then be following on their own board. So that is graphemes. And then the last key term is a morpheme, and that is the smallest unit of meaning. And often we think about a grapheme in the sense of a suffix, like in the word played. ED is that suffix. And what it's doing there is it's changing the meaning of the word play to played. So it's going from the present tense to the past tense. And so that is the morpheme ED. And it is the smallest unit of meaning in this word. So those are 3 key terms to really understand to kind of get that foundation before we jump in. The next thing that's really important to keep in mind, that the science of reading teaches us that learning to read is not a natural process. And so we know that learning to speak is a natural process that students learn through exposure, but learning to read is not. It needs explicit systematic instruction and a really understanding the way that the brain learns to read. And so that's why we're going to look at that process today, is to really understand the complexity of it and how to instruct so that students can learn to read and develop the process. So let's jump into how the brain learns words. So the first important thing to understand is that every word has 3 forms. It has its sounds, which are the phonemes, its spelling, which are the graphemes, and its meaning, which are those morphemes, those 3 key terms that we just went over. So if we take a look at an example here, like in the word horse, when we take a look at that brain, we can see that we have different areas that are activating when we're reading. And so it's important to understand that activation to be able to make sure that we're targeting all of that through our instruction. So we're looking at the word horse here. And in the front part of our brain, that's where we're articulating and pronouncing that word. So we hear the word horse, we can say it aloud. And then in the back part of our brain, that's that visual word recognition, where we see those letters and we recognize those letters. And if we've stored that word in our long-term memory, then we visually recognize it as a sight word automatically. And then if we don't, we're really analyzing the word. We're analyzing those relationships and going from the phoneme to the grapheme, knowing that the H says the OR says or, and the SE says s. That's creating that phoneme grapheme relationship. And so even if we can say the word, recognize it, read it, decode it, it doesn't really give us anything unless we also have that meaning or that context. So that's why we can't just teach phonics alone. We also need to teach that meaning or the language comprehension to really understand that word and associate it with our background knowledge. And so that process that I just described is orthographic mapping, is connecting all of those pieces of the brain to be able to activate when reading. So let's look at this one piece at a time now. We're going to jump in and look at each step of the way how this happens. And so while this is really happening very quickly, I'm going to slow it down so we can see what's happening in the brain. So to define orthographic mapping, it's the process that we use to store words in long-term memory. That's according to Kilpatrick. So the ultimate goal of orthographic mapping is to store those words in our long-term memory. And when it is an automatic process, then students just know that word right away, and it makes reading fluent, and it enables students to really focus on deepening their comprehension. If they're not focusing in on decoding a word, they're able to really focus on meaning, which is that ultimate goal of reading. So let's look at how this process happens. So to start, we have that visual input. We've got the left hemisphere of our brain here. That's what this is showing, which is really the part of the brain that's most responsible for reading. And so our visual input, a reader sees a word, they see those lines and shapes and squiggles that make up a word, like, for example, in the word horse in English and caballo in Spanish, because when we're thinking about the reading brain, it doesn't matter what language we're talking about. It's the same regardless of language. So we'll look at English and Spanish as the example. So here we have our reader seeing a word and recognizing those shapes and lines as letters. Then this input, it's going to shoot to the back of the brain where we recognize those letters. We understand them as each individual piece. So we have in the word horse, we've got the H says the OR says or, and the SC says s. And in Spanish, it's broken up here in syllable, caballo. So that's the way that that connection, our visual sees those letters and lines and shapes. We are thinking about it in terms of the phonemes and graphemes. And we're connecting here. We're connecting the speech sounds to the letters. We're building that bridge, and you can see that's a pretty big bridge between those parts of the brain, connecting the input and the output. And because of that, we have this word analysis area to help that connection, to help build that bridge between the speech and the sound and the letters. And so we have this word analysis area that's helping us connect those phonemes and the graphemes there so that our brain connects the speech sound to the letter H, and it's connecting each of those pieces. And then, of course, we also need to develop the meaning of the word horse, because we have to understand and be able to visualize, what does a horse look like? And we have to understand how that connects and relates to our background knowledge. So what we have in our brain is this semantic map that connects all of those pieces. And so that's why it's really important to build that meaning while you're teaching students phonics. Continue to build that meaning so they build all of those connections in their brain and not just focus solely on phonics. And going back to orthographic mapping, let's really just talk about the ultimate purpose. The ultimate purpose of this is for readers to store a word in long-term memory. because when they have it stored, then they no longer have to sound it out, and it's then a sight word. And so it has to be stored in this visual word form area. It's kind of like a very organized filing system for words. And they're organized by pattern. It's not just haphazard or disorganized, they're very clearly organized. So we can help as teachers to build that organizational system by teaching in a very explicit and systematic way, and not just teaching to memorize words by sight, but teaching those specific patterns so students recognize them, and then it's more easily organized and filed and stored in that long-term memory. And having that stored properly frees up a reader to be able to really focus on their comprehension and the ultimate goal of reading, to develop meaning. So let's look at a few more examples of what orthographic mapping looks like in practice. So how do these three forms connect? Here's an example of the word cats. So if we look at that, we can see that we've got this word that's made up of the graphemes C-A-T-S. S is also our morpheme because this is the meaning changing unit. That changes it from one singular cat to multiple cats. And then we have the phonemes that are represented by the graphemes. So we've got K is represented by C, A is represented by A, T is represented by T, and S is represented by S. So those phonemes and graphemes are connected there. And then we have our meaning. We can understand that it's not just one cat, but cats means more than one, multiple cats. And so this process involves two pieces. We have decoding words and encoding words. So when we're decoding, a reader sees a word on the page and they're connecting those letters to a sound and blending them to form a spoken word. So like in the example cat, you see that word there, and then a reader is decoding it, breaking it up into those pieces and saying k, a, t, cat. So being able to really understand the sounds in that word, isolate them, manipulate them, and be able to recognize them, that is going to build the decoding skills of a reader. And then we have encoding skills. Encoding is the process of hearing that word and then breaking it into the sounds and writing the letters that represent it. So if someone hears the word cat, they're breaking it up into k, a, t, and then attaching the letters C-A-T. So those are the two pieces that we'll be focusing in on as you see a lesson in a little bit. We'll be focusing in on decoding words and encoding words. And it's important to see that this is really like a reciprocal process here. So we're doing both hand in hand in a lesson because they build each other. Reading and spelling really go together. And you'll see that happen in the lesson as we're using those magnetic letters. You'll see that students are learning how to read and spell words. So why orthographic mapping? Why should we even focus on this? What does it ultimately lead to? Well, the purpose is to lead to fluent reading, because once that word is stored in long-term memory, a student can then be really fluent, because then they're an accurate reader. They're reading words really accurately. They don't have to focus in on decoding them. They're automatic with their reading. It comes quickly and smoothly and easily. And then their prosody is also really well developed, which is their reading expression. And we know when a reader is very expressive, that is showing that they're understanding what they're reading. And so fluent reading is going to lead to that ultimate goal of reading comprehension. And so we want students to be very automatic and accurate with their words to be able to have that reading fluency. So orthographic mapping is going to lead to fluent reading and a reader that is very strong in their comprehension skills. So that's why we need to focus in on this early on, because what we see is that students that are not correctly mapping words, they're going to struggle with reading. So now that we have that sort of foundational understanding of what the research is telling us, we have that why behind what we're doing, we're going to transfer that over to practice. So how do we use this research in the classroom? How do we put that into practice? So we'll answer these questions as we go through. So what does orthographic mapping look like in practice? You'll get to see a lesson in action with using these magnetic letters. You'll get to see how orthographic mapping becomes visible for students through using these letters. Because when we hear a word out loud, it just disappears and it's gone. But when we're putting it out on the magnet board, students can visibly see it. And then we'll talk all about how these tools really make it a very concrete, tactile approach to learning. So let's talk about the skills that are involved here, because what's really important to remember is that orthographic mapping itself is not a skill, it's a process. So the skills that are involved include these three pieces here. We've got phonemic awareness, which is that hearing of a sound like I in the word ship and recognizing that sound in a word, that it comes in the middle of a word. Being able to really isolate that, manipulate sounds and words, blend them together, really being able to identify them, that is super important for students, because without that, it's going to make it that much more difficult to then attach a letter to the sound. So we need to teach the phonemic awareness, which is going to build that ability to develop letter sound correspondence and knowing that I is represented by the letter I. And then that's going to enable students to decode it when it's within the context of a word, like in the word ship. They'll be able to break it up into sh, I, and be able to really see how those letters are represented by sounds and be able to put those pieces together. So these are the skills that you'll see taught within that lesson. And so remember, orthographic mapping is the process. These are the specific skills. And then we have the learning tools. So the learning tools that I'll be using today are magnetic letters and word work boards. And so you'll see here that this is the tin of letters that you get within our set, and the board has places for the letters of the alphabet, and you'll see that right behind those letters, like the letters go here, but right behind it is a really easy way for students to replace those letters and put them back on the board. So we have here, the blue are all of our consonants and the pink are the vowels. And in our set, we also include blue vowels in case you don't want to show the distinction between those. Some curriculum teach it in different ways. And then part of the set also includes digraphs, units, R-controlled vowels, vowel teams, diphthongs, and suffixes. And it also includes this space down here for students to build words and then write them. And so as you can see here, I don't have all of the graphemes on the board. And especially for a young student, an early reader, you're not going to want to do that. You're going to want to just put on the letters that students need for that particular lesson. And so that's the way this board is organized, and you'll get to see it in action as I do the lesson. And what's also really important to remember and think about is, why is this even a valuable tool? So why use magnetic letters? Well, it's for several different reasons. The first is that it really reduces cognitive load. So what that means is then that a reader or student doesn't have to think about those graphemes, doesn't have to think about how to put it together, because when we have it on the board, it's all right there in front of them. They don't have to recall from memory all the different ways to spell a certain sound. It's right there in front of them. It also reduces the cognitive load because they don't have to think about the letter formation. So if they're spelling the word cat, they don't have to think about the way the C is formed, the way the A is formed, or the way the T is formed. It's just right there on the board for them. They're just pulling the letters down and they're able to really focus in on those specific skills of decoding and encoding without adding to the cognitive load of recalling those letter sound relationships and then recalling how to actually put it to paper. So another piece is that it's multimodal. It's multisensory for students. It's tactile, it's hands-on, it's colorful. Students are able to see the different types of patterns really easily and clearly. And that is going to make that phoneme-grapheme correspondence really visible by showing it in this hands-on tactile way. And one of the other really most important pieces here is that it provides an opportunity for every student to respond, because every student should have their own magnet board and magnet set so that they're able to respond as learning is happening. So if you have one student that's up on the board and is using these foam magnets, that's only one student that's having the opportunity to respond, versus if you have each student having their own board, they're learning along with everyone. They're responding as the teacher is prompting, and they're remaining engaged, they're remaining focused, and it's just going to increase that overall learning. And so it makes the learning visible for not only the student, but for the teacher as well, because as a teacher is circulating around the room and looking at what students are doing, they can easily see right away, oh, that student didn't understand what was happening. I can work with them, maybe pull a small group. It just makes that learning a lot more visible and targeted if you can see every student with their magnet board out versus just having one student come up to the board and navigate those letters. So that's really all of those pieces make these magnetic letters a really key piece of instruction when it comes to the skills of orthographic mapping. So we're going to move into orthographic mapping in action now. And I'm going to show you a little sample lesson in a moment. But these are the pieces that we're thinking of when we're looking at orthographic mapping in action. We're going to start with the say it. So students say the word that they're being instructed. They're tapping out the sounds. They're mapping it on the workspace, and then they're graphing it. And now, depending on the age of students, you might only have them focus on those top three, the say it, tap it, and map it, to really just get that down so that we're reducing the cognitive load of writing it, maybe at first, and then building that in, especially if students are struggling with letter formation. We want to focus on these top three, and you'll see that during this lesson that I'm doing right now. You'll see that happening. And so what we'll also talk about after the lesson is just really how to be organized with teaching a lesson using magnetic letters. How do we set a student up for success? How do we set ourselves and our whole class up for success with magnets? So we'll talk a little bit about that after the lesson. But what I want you to pay attention to during the lesson is how do you see the magnets moving? What types of questions are being asked? What does that instruction look like? So I'm just going to turn my camera off during this lesson, and then you will get to see it in action. Here we go. So I'm going to walk you through a lesson for how to use the magnet board and the magnets for reading and spelling words. And I'm going to do this exactly how I would teach it in the classroom with a group of students. And so I've got my magnet board set up with all the letters of the alphabet. And you'll notice that we've got our vowels in pink and the consonants in blue. And each student will have their own magnet board and their own set of magnets. And as the teacher, you might be modeling this under a document camera or on the board. But it's really important that each student has their own board and magnets, and they're able to touch and move the letters on their own. So let's get started. So today we are going to practice building words, and we're going to be changing just one sound at a time to make a new word. So really listen closely to the sounds in each word and use your letters to build and read them. So let's begin. We're going to start with the word cat and make that on our board. So let's say that together. Let's say the sounds in the word cat together. So in the word cat, we've got k, a, t. We've got 3 sounds, k, a, t. So let's think about how we're going to build that word. We're going to start with the k sound. So that is with the letter C, k, and then we have a, and then we have t. So we have k, a, t, cat. So now what we're going to do is we're going to change the C. We're going to change that letter C to an S. So let's do that. Let's change the letter C. I can put it right back on my board. I can match it back up there. And I'm going to grab the S and put it down there. So now let's figure out, what word do we have here? What word do we have? We've got s, a, t, sat. So we changed cat to sat. And we just changed which letter in the word? We changed that first letter from a C to an S. Okay, good. Now let's change the S to an H. So I'm going to change that S to an H. And now what word do I have? Let's see. I've got at, hat. I have the word hat, like a hat that you put on your head. So now what I want to do is now I'm going to change this word hat to hit. I want to change hat to hit. And so when I hear that, I want to change one of those letters in there to go from the word hat to hit. Which letter do you think I might be changing there? Going from hat to hit. I'm changing that letter A that says a to the letter I that says I, and now I've got it, hit. So which letter did I change there? I changed that middle letter from an A to an I, so I went from hat to hit. Okay. Now I'm going to change the H to an S. So I'm changing the H to an S. So now let's figure out what word we have here. What word is that? Let's try to sound it out together. I've got s, I, t, sit. I changed hit to sit. So which letter did I change? Yes, I changed that first letter from an H to an S to go from hit to sit. Now, listen carefully. Which letter do you think I need to change the word sit to make it fit? I want to change sit to fit. What letter do I need to change there? Yeah, I need to change that first letter. What letter do we hear? What sound do we hear at the beginning of fit? I hear an F. So I'm going to change my word from sit to fit, and I've got it, fit. Good job. You did an amazing job building words, reading words, and spelling words. Awesome. So let's take a look at what did I really focus on during this lesson. These are the 2 pieces that were happening, decoding and encoding. So what decoding was represented by in the lesson was when I said, For example, change C to S, like starting with the word cat, change that C to an S, and then sounding out, what word do you have now? S, at, sat. So that is the decoding piece. The encoding piece is when I said things like change sit to fit, because we're having to figure out what letter does it need to change to go from S in sit to the F in fit. And you're thinking about what letter did you change? So this is focusing in on what word do you have? That's the decoding piece. And the encoding piece is what letter did you change? So those are the two pieces that are happening when you're using those magnetic letters during the lesson. So let's talk about organizing. Oops. So I'm going to play a little video in a moment so you can see a little bit of what organization can look like in the classroom.
It looks like a lot of her letters are still puzzled. Get puzzled, spit them out, be gentle.
So what you'll see there is that students have easy access to their materials. And you can think about however you typically have students store their materials. Do you use bins, do you use chair bags or cubbies? However you already organize materials, these boards and magnets can fit right in. And so you can see that students were taking their board directly from those bins, and many of them had them in those pocket sleeves. And the pocket sleeves are great because they protect those boards and keep them from getting scratched or ruined. And students keep their magnets on the board, the ones that they're using. The rest can be kept in these tins. If they're not being used, you can put a child's name on here and they can store these in whatever storage system you have. But it's really important that you only put out those magnets that you are using, and students keep the rest in their tin. And that way it just keeps them from getting lost. And that's just a little bit about organization. So do whatever works best in your classroom. These are some different options. And then you also want to think about your routines. Just like you think about routines for everything else in the classroom, you want to think about a good routine that works for your class when it comes to the magnets and boards. So thinking about, how do you want them to take out their boards? How do you want them to interact with them when they're during a lesson? Where are they going to use them? Do they use them on the rug, at their desk? And then thinking about, how do you care for magnets and boards? So really making sure that, just like any other material in the classroom, students are learning how to care for the magnets and boards. So those are the things that you just want to consider, because when you have these routines really down and really well structured, expectations are clear, it's just going to make that learning so much smoother, so much easier for students if you can just focus in on the teaching and not about the routine. And so you might want to just have them practice these routines even before they actually do a lesson, because getting them to interact with the magnets and the tools before they have to use it for learning can kind of free up their curiosity on how they work. So I would definitely recommend doing a little introduction for how to use them before you dive into the learning. Okay, so I'm going to ask a question, and I'm going to say the first person in the chat will be the winner of this giveaway. And so here is my question for you. How many phonemes are in the English? Oh, I got it already. Yay, awesome. Excellent. So it looks like Linda was the first one, 44 phonemes. Excellent job. So Linda, one of us will be in touch. You got it. You were paying attention to our beginning. And maybe, I don't know if anyone knows this. I didn't mention it. I forgot to. How many graphemes are there in the English language? As a little bonus, does anyone know? I didn't mention it. It's actually quite a lot. How many graphemes there are. I've got some guesses. It surprised me when I looked at it too, actually, because it depends on the type of English. Like if you're doing British English or Australian or Canadian, because there's all the different graphemes, it's actually over 250. There are over 250 graphemes, so that's a good little trivia question that I forgot to mention earlier. But that's why when we think about why English is so challenging, there's 250 different graphemes that can be all those different combinations. So it's pretty wild to think that we're expecting children to be able to memorize all of this. That's why having these tools is really so critical. So that is the end of our webinar, and I'm going to move into some specific questions now. But just know that if you do have to leave, it is being recorded. You'll get the handouts and slides. But we'll move into the Q&A now, and I'll go back to, let me pull up some of those questions. And yes, we will do there will be future webinars, and the best way to just keep updated with those future webinars is if you follow us on social media. We always post information about our webinars. We're doing tons of giveaways too on social media. And so that will always be posted. We've just released some new Spanish teaching tools. So there'll be some future webinars about those. So definitely stay in touch. Oh, I just saw a question. Will there be one on morphology? Yes, that will be related to some of the prefix suffix tools, and we have some new tools that will be coming out in Spanish that have to do with morphology. So there'll definitely be webinars about that as well. Yeah. So let me grab my questions here, and I will jump right in. So one of the questions I had was, do teachers use this in whole group instruction or mostly in small groups? So it can be done in both, and I've seen both, and it really just depends on the setup of your classroom. So whether or not you have the ability to do a whole class, and if you have all the materials to be able to do that and the resources. Otherwise, this could be done as like the teacher station of your literacy rotation. Like if you do small group literacy and you have them working in different rotations, this could be the teacher station. And that way you can have, 6 boards and 6 tins of magnets rather than getting one for every child in the class if you can't do it as a whole group. And so if you are doing it as a small group, students can do the same routine of grabbing their board and bringing it over if they have their individual board. If not, the teacher can kind of take control of the boards and have them ready for students. So those are a couple different options. But if you are doing it as a whole group, I've seen some teachers that have students do the whole group instruction at their desk, and then some teachers will have them do it on the rug. It just depends on like your students and how comfortable they are. So you could do it either way, depending on what works for your students. So, okay, so some other questions. Let's see. How do I know if my students are developing the skills of orthographic mapping? Like, how do I assess this? How do I know that it's actually working for them? Well, one of the things that you can really look at is students' sight word recognition. Like, how are they storing words in their long-term memory? How automatic are they when they're reading? Are there fewer decoding errors? Like, what errors are you noticing in their reading? And how is their spelling accuracy? Like looking at those and comparing that to like, okay, what have I already instructed? Have I already instructed about short vowels? And we've spent quite a bit of time. Are they decoding short vowel words? Are they spelling short vowel words? Like looking at the patterns of what's been taught and how that is being shown within their reading and their spelling. And that's how you'll know that they're mastering that orthographic mapping. So those would be the indicators. There's not like an assessment specific to orthographic mapping. It's going to show when we see students applying those skills. Let's see, other questions. What might prevent a student from developing strong orthographic mapping skills? So, you know, we all have struggling learners in our classroom. We all see students, you know, that need that increased instruction. And maybe that's when they might need a small group to review or repeat something that's already been taught. And so some of the skills that might be weak for that particular student, maybe they haven't really developed their phonemic awareness skills. Maybe they need more practice in that, because if students are having difficulty with the phonemic awareness and identifying the sounds in a word, then they're going to have trouble with mapping that with a letter, so that they're not going to be able to have as strong of that phoneme grapheme connection if their phonemic awareness is weak. Maybe they have difficulty with the pattern itself and they need more practice with the pattern. Or maybe a child needs a little bit more practice, like in the context of reading, like reading a decodable book, practicing that fluency, and they need just more of that application practice. So those are the three things that can kind of get in the way of learning, would be the phonemic awareness skills, not having difficulty with the phoneme grapheme mapping, or having less ability to practice reading. So those would be things to focus on. Let's see. I have another question. So what is happening in a student's brain when they can decode correctly, but they're struggling with encoding? And so a lot of times we'll see that with a student. We'll see a student that is able to decode fairly well, but then it's not translating into the encoding process. And that could be for a number of different reasons. And it might, you know, part of what you'll be figuring out as a teacher is like, where are those gaps with the spelling? Are there certain patterns that are very strong when it comes to spelling, or are there weaker patterns that they need that much more practice with? And that's where the magnet board can come in really handy, because you can first practice the encoding on the board, and then you can have students practice it below with writing. And that way you're having that direct transfer, because sometimes the cognitive load of a student writing and having to do the actual like physical act of writing can slow down that spelling process. Like maybe they struggle with the actual letter formation. So building that first, building that through the magnet board, and then having them write can help build that spelling up. But I would say targeting the specific spelling rules that a child needs and really focusing in on those one at a time will really help build that. Let's see, some other questions. Okay, so my curriculum doesn't include this type of instruction. Where can I get resources so I know how to teach a lesson? Like, how do you know? I just went through like a short little section of how to use a word workboard, but not all curriculum teaches this. It's not in every curriculum yet. And so what I would say is, if you have a phonics curriculum that you're using, you can align it to using the magnet board to teach orthographic mapping, no matter what phonics lesson you have. And so if you have some word chaining, you know, suggestions in your curriculum, you can use the magnet board with the word chaining that's within your curriculum, and you can follow that. But if you don't have word chaining within your curriculum, then you're going to have to look for some other resources. So like, if, for example, if you're having to teach, you know, the short I sound, and you need some word chaining, exercises for that, I'll put together in my email a list of some resources so that you can find some good word chains to go along with your lesson. But don't feel like you need to completely change your phonics lesson. This is just one piece of it that you're like adding to what you're already doing. And, you know, if you have a good scope and sequence, use that scope and sequence and then incorporate the orthographic mapping and the magnet board into what you're already doing. Because, you know, using that scope and sequence, it's there for a reason, and you want students to, you know, stay on that curriculum, but you can just add this into it. Let's see. Now, the other thing to know is that, our curriculum is designed to be used, our materials are designed to be used with any curriculum. And so your curriculum might differ from what we have. So someone was asking about the colors and the letters and matching different curriculum. So, not all of your curriculum might have different graphemes that are included. Like we've got, a whole group of diphthongs and suffixes, and your curriculum might have different ones that are introduced. So I would say if your curriculum doesn't introduce a certain grapheme, don't have your students put it on the board. Just include what's in your curriculum. And then if you need to add a grapheme that's not in our set, you can write it in. A lot of teachers will write it in and write it on the board. And that way it can be included. So just different curriculum teach different things. And you might point out if there's different color coding, like the color coding that's in these magnets versus the ones that are within your curriculum. You might have to really explain that to students, just depending on what you have. And let's see, other questions. Let me see if there's any other ones. So yeah, I talked about how, with young students in kindergarten, you might not want to put every single magnet on there. You might just start with the letters and add them one at a time to however you're teaching, because that kind of builds up the excitement too a little bit. And especially if you're doing a small group, you can have the board set up for them. And that way students, get to the station and they get started right away on it. If you're having students, older students, they can manage their board a little bit more easily and take the magnets from the tin and place it on the board themselves. So just depends on the independence of your students, but I would definitely not put all the magnets on right away, because it's going to be really overwhelming to students visually, just adding them a little bit at a time. Let's see, any other questions? Don't think so, but I think that we'll definitely be sending out all of this next week. So you'll get a copy of the recording, the handouts, the slides, all of this will come next week. So if you know people that wanted to be here and missed it, let them know that they'll get it. And if you have people that didn't sign up and you think it would be great for them, it will also be going on our YouTube at some point. So that way you'll be able to direct them to that too. And there's other videos on our YouTube. So if this is your first webinar that you've come to, we have other webinars on there. We have one about sound walls and one about heart words. So those are on there too if you want more information about that as well. So I want to thank everyone for being here. I really appreciate it. And like I said, you can follow us on social media for giveaways in the future, for future webinars. And I'm just really grateful that you're here, because you're here after school to learn, and that is amazing. And your students are so lucky. So thank you so much for being here. I appreciate it. And if you have any questions I didn't answer, you can stay on if you want to ask me anything.